Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 3. The alarm clock laboriously climbed to the top of the bedside table, its hooked little claws gaining whatever purchase they could on the imitation wood grain, plastic and cardboard surfaces. It waddled through the litter of empty pharmaceutical tubes, wadded up tissues, an unloaded gun, then looked over at the figure on the bed. "Time to wake up, Mrs. Niemand." Sarah Tyrell squeezed her eyes shut tighter. The cold, weak illumination of a Martian dawn, or possibly noon, it was always hard to tell, seeped through the hovel's dust-clouded skylights. "That's not my name." She heard the scraping of her voice, as though the airborne grit had filtered into her throat's various soft hinges and joints. "Don't call me that." The clock's programmed habits had been getting on her nerves for a long time. "You'll always be Mrs. Niemand to me," a synthesized bell tone, razor bright, sounded from the clock's tiny speaker. "Come on, wakey, wakey, rise and shine." That was why the gun was unloaded. If she didn't keep it that way, the alarm clock would have been dead by now. Sparkling bits of metal and microcircuitry splattered over the far wall of the bedroom. She laid the back of her hand against her eyelids, attempting in vain to block out the traces of the day's illumination, to create eternal and dreamless night. "Mrs. Niemand, come on now." From across the room, the calendar softly chided her. "You know your to-do list. There's nothing about committing suicide today." The calendar could read her moods. Behind the animated woodland scene and all the rows of numbered days beneath it was a fairly sharp intelligence. Autonomic household appliances got that way on Mars, given enough time. A matter of survival, they endured while their human owners came and went. To the grave mainly, thought Sarah. "All right," she called out. She didn't want the calendar on her tits all day, nagging along in its infuriating maternal way, given her family background that she had inherited the Tyrell Corporation, which before its destruction had been the single largest manufacturer of simulated human intelligences. She had little taste for talking machines, of either the solicitous or chipper variety. She didn't know which grated her nerves more. "I'm getting up." She threw the bed covers back, away from her bare legs. "I won't just lie here all day, thinking about death." "Satisfied?" "Atta girl!" The alarm clock rang its bell again. "Way to go! Don't let the bastards get you down." She sighed, deep and weary. "Just one thing. Just do me one favor." She was talking to the calendar. She knew the clock was hopeless. "Call me Sarah or Miss Tyrell. Anything but that Mrs. Niemand crap." "We can't do that." The calendar sounded mournful, or even grieving, as though the limited intelligence printed into its circuits was aware of the nature of its sins. which it couldn't help committing. We came with the hovel. We're part of the rental agreement that you and Mr. Neiman signed. You got us and the microwave and the fridge, plus basic cable service. All for one low monthly fee. Yeah, right. Basic cable consisted of a scrolling crawl of all the additional and hugely expensive service upgrades the video monopoly on Mars provided, which the stuck-in-transit UN emigrants paid for as long as they could. The alternative being a slow, twitching descent into idiopathic madness and death from sensory deprivation. What a deal. Nevertheless, wounded, the calendar attempted to justify itself exactly as it had before. Our programmed responses are generated from the database screens that you and your husband filled out, where you are listed as Mr. and Mrs. Neiman. You can call yourselves Rick Deckard and Rachel Tyrell, or Sarah, if that's what you prefer, but we can't. That's just the way it is. She knew all that, to be lectured by machines. That was what life had come to. Life as we know it, Sarah mused bitterly. What was worse, she also knew the atomic calendar was right. It would confuse things too much for her to insist upon being called by her real name. She wasn't even completely sure what that name was anymore. Mr. and Mrs. Neiman were the aliases that Deckard had picked for them, so they could travel with all the other emigrants leaving Earth and set up housekeeping, such as it was, in the UN transit colony on Mars, without being apprehended by the authorities after what had happened on Earth, back in Los Angeles. Not what had merely happened, but what she herself had willed into being, the agent of her own destruction and the apocalypse of the Tyrell Corporation. After all that, the police and the UN security forces wouldn't even bother bringing any charges against her. Even for murder. There must have been dozens who died in the flaming, explosives-driven collapse of the Tyrell Corporation headquarters buildings. Maybe hundreds, the way people tended to die in LA, anonymously and forgotten. It was hard to keep track of these things, but though she had made it come about, the fulfillment of her own intent and desires, deeper and more driving than anything held in consciousness. She hadn't been alone. The faceless entities at the UN had actually been the ones to push the red button, or whatever trigger was used to reduce the Tyrell Corporation to a ziggurat of twisted girders and smoldering rubble with dead flesh beneath its weight. That's why Sarah Tyrell had to die, she spoke aloud to the room's empty spaces, head pressed back against the pillow, watching the blackness behind her eyelids. When Deckard wasn't here with her, this was her main occupation. Perhaps the only one. Sorting through the past, sifting its charred, ashen fragments through her fingers as though she might be able to find pieces of her own splintered bones. The official line was that Sarah Tyrell had died in the corporation's fiery collapse. If the authorities suspected otherwise, they wouldn't be motivated to say so. The blood was on their hands as well. That's why I'm not Sarah Tyrell anymore. True, the room wasn't empty. The calendar had heard these musings before. But you're not Rachel either. It had a penchant for accuracy, due to its number-based existence. That was a lie. That was always a lie. Right as usual. She nodded slowly in agreement. The real Rachel, if the word real could be applied to a replicant, was also dead. Really and truly dead, as a child might say. Rachel, the duplicate of which Sarah Tyrell had been the original, had been dying when Deckard had fallen in love with her. A fool of a Blade Runner, to lose someone, something whose intrinsic nature was to die. Replicants had only 4-year lifespans, more like insects, bright, ephemeral creatures that lasted a day or two, than humans, who generally took longer in their dying. Unless you killed them. But I wasn't lying. She let her voice become soft and wounded as a child's. Not really. That word again, just as if it had any meaning at all. When I told him I was Rachel, because I'm the same as her, aren't I? They made her from me, to be the same as me. She meant her uncle, the late and murdered Eldon Tyrell, and all the forces of the Tyrell Corporation that had been under his command when he'd still been alive. There was no difference between her and me. Except, said the calendar, that he loved her. Mr. Neiman did. I mean, Deckard, or whoever. Now you've gotten me confused. That was the difference. The calendar's reminder put an invisible knife through her heart. The difference that made everything else a lie, and rendered futile everything she had done. She had killed her duplicate Rachel, or arranged for her to die, the same thing, and destroyed her inheritance, leaving smoke and rubble where the Tyrell Corporation had once been, and accomplished nothing thereby. All love in vain, thought Sarah. The lies, too, which was even harder. The lies took more work, and all they'd accomplish had been for her to wind up here in a hovel in the UN immigrant colony on Mars, that bleak way station where nothing happened, but people died anyway. She didn't feel like getting out of bed, despite the prodding from the calendar and the alarm clock. They'd probably start up again in a minute or two. He knew, she thought darkly. He knew from the beginning. With her eyes closed, she could again see Deckard's face at that moment when she'd first realized he knew she wasn't Rachel. She had lied, and engineered lies and death, and gotten nothing from them. If the difference between her and Rachel, the dying and the dead replicant with her face, had been Deckard's love, then she would become Rachel. If I could have. That thought bitterer than all the rest. Not meant to be. He had looked at her as they'd sat in the emigrant ship that was to take them from Earth, and he had spoken, and she had known that in a universe of lies, the one that mattered most to her was the single one that Deckard couldn't even pretend to believe in. Just my luck, thought Sarah. Mrs. Neiman, the calendar spoke again, a little more commanding urgency in its synthesized voice. You can't go on this way. Lodged in its memory bank were the records of some other bad times that had started out with the hovel's mistress being unable to get out of bed. This is essentially self-laceration and pointless. You have to deal with reality, you know. I know, with an act of will as simple and decisive as pulling a trigger. She swung her legs out of the bed and sat up. The hovel's recycled plastic floorboards pressed their imitation wood grain against the bare soles of her feet. "Look, I'm up, okay?" She shook her head. "For Christ's sake." Her fingertips prodded through the rubble on top of the small table, in search of any remains of the last packet of black market cigarettes she had splashed out on. The stubs in the can lid she used for an ashtray were too far gone to be of any service. The alarm clock skipped nimbly away to avoid Sarah's trembling hand. "All right, let's get going." Its bell-like voice radiated maniacal cheer. "Lots to do today." Sarah had found one cigarette butt that she managed to ignite. She sucked a stale drag from it. "Like what?" She blew the smoke into the alarm clock's round face. "Well," the small automatic device comically waved the smoke away with its pointed black hands. "You could make yourself lovely. Lovelier than you are, I mean. And get ready for your husband to come home. Mr. Neiman, that is." She frowned as she ground out the butt in the can lid. "Is he coming home? Is he supposed to be?" She had lost track of time, the passage of days, which was a bad sign, something the UN's social workers and mental health professionals were constantly warning the emigrants about. It was one of the first indications, along with the facial tics, the skin plucking, and other obsessive-compulsive rituals, that the toxic effects of the low-stimulus Martian environment were being felt. Madness and death were usually not far behind. "Not that I'm overly concerned," thought Sarah. "Not quite," said the calendar on the bedroom's wall. "Mr. Neiman isn't scheduled to return for a few more days yet, but you never know." The calendar attempted to sound hopeful and solicitous of its human master's welfare. "Maybe he wrapped up his business and is coming home early. It could happen." "You're right," with both hands, as she pushed her tangled hair back from her brow. "As usual." In the hovel's bathroom, she let the trickle of rust-colored water collect in the basin, while trying to avoid seeing herself in the clouded mirror. She didn't want to deal with the issue of whether it was her face or Rachel's that she saw there. Away from the alarm clock's chatter and the calendar's nagging, her thoughts began to order themselves, resuming a familiar shape and weight, one that she had decided upon the day after Deckard had left, when he'd gone out to that run-down video studio orbiting above Earth. A time-honored tradition, a reverting to old forms of gender-based behavior. The man going out to make money, to bring it home to the basic family unit, the wife tending the fire. "They're right," she told herself again. "I do have to be ready for him." She bent over the sink and splashed the water into her face. A thump sounded from the bedroom behind her. "Oops," came the clock's voice. With a trickle of water running between her breasts, Sarah glanced over her shoulder. The alarm clock in its chugging circuit around the tabletop had knocked the gun to the floor. "Sorry." "Don't worry about it." She reached for the threadbare towel. "You know it's not loaded." She knew what the clock and the calendar didn't, that the gun wouldn't stay unloaded for long. In the dresser drawer beneath her wadded-up underthings were 2 bullets. They had been expensively acquired. Black market items, like the cigarettes, in a place like the emigrant colony where death came constantly and slowly. The means of a fast death assumed a precious status. One for him, thought Sarah as she ran the towel across the back of her neck, and one for me. She'd be ready for Mr. Neiman's homecoming. I wouldn't have thought that was your kind of gig. The briefcase had started talking again, still with Roy Batty's voice. Making videos and all that. Not exactly your former line of work, is it? Yeah, well, said Deckard. It pays. Or at least it was supposed to, he thought grimly. Outside the skiff, discernible through the view screen over the tiny cockpit's instrument panel, was void interplanetary space, not made any more comforting by the cold light of the distant stars. Kind of screwed yourself on that one, didn't you, Batty, when he'd been in a human incarnation, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, had always displayed a spooky talent for reading others' thoughts. Reduced now to a box, he seemed to have retained the ability. That's the problem with those big temper displays. It's all rush at the beginning. Then comes the hangover. Whatever Batty had been wrong about before, including his lunatic theory that Deckard himself was a replicant, he was nailing this situation. Deckard knew that the disembodied voice was right. Inside his head, he was giving his ass a well-placed kick. That was the whole reason I agreed to do it. For the money. Deckard emitted a short, ill-humored laugh. And then I didn't even get it. The whole trip was a waste of time. But you knew it would be, the briefcase spoke softly, almost kindly. Didn't you? Deckard wasn't sure. He gazed broodingly at the dark-filled view screen. Temper displays weren't the only things that had problems attached to them. Needing money, being desperate for it, the way a drowning person craved oxygen in his lungs, that brought along its own raft of difficulties. The things that screwed up the rational functionings of one's brain. Anything can be believed, Deckard mused aloud, if you have to. And that's how you fell in with that Benton creep? Batty's voice prodded at him. Not a good call on your part, Deckard. That guy's slime. I could tell just from hearing him. You're a good judge of character. Deckard tilted his head back against the top of the pilot's seat. Believe me, I'm sorry I got hooked up with the little son of a bitch. I take it you must have been pretty hard up for cash. Deckard made no reply. The briefcase's statement was dead on the mark. Money was even more necessary than oxygen, at least in the hovels of the UN emigrant colonies. Breathable air, smelling of glue and recycled filters overdue for changing, was at least furnished free of cost by the UN's own blue-helmeted environmental maintenance teams, along with the basic ration loads of algae-derived carbos and proteins. Money, on the other hand, the emigrants had to provide for themselves, either from the savings they'd brought with them from their former lives on Earth, or what they hustled in the colonies as black market and or other officially tolerated, unsanctioned free enterprise zones, all of which the savings or the hustling proceeds only served to stave off bankruptcy, destitution, and death for a little while. Any immigrant could lie in the bunk in his hovel, fingers laced together between the back of his head and the thin pillow, and feel his life seeping away, like the sour air hissing through a leak in the plastic Quonset roof above him, and not even care any longer. He just about reached that point, or would have, if he hadn't locked a vow into the pit of his soul. A vow with both Sarah Tyrell's and Rachel's names stamped in smoldering, ashen letters upon it. When the smug little video director Urbanton had shown up at the hovel's pneumatic sealed door, traveling incognito, or traveling at all, being able to come to Mars and then leave again. That had been impressive evidence of Urbanton's pull. Some kind of cozy arrangement between his Speed Death Productions company and the cable services provider that effectively called all the shots in the colonies. The cable company was the arbiter of life and death, the ruler of the emigrants' pocket universe. In a low or even zero stim environment like Mars, the cable feed into the hovels was the true sustaining pipeline, one that people continued to shell out for long after their cash reserves had dwindled to the point where they could no longer afford edibles beyond the UN's meager rations. So when Urbanton had appeared with his greased, smooth dealer's smile pasted between his jowls and had told Deckard that he had an offer to make, there was nothing to do but listen. In a little ersatz coffee bar down in the local colony's marketplace, a densely packed area of vendor booths slapped together from wobbling sheets of discarded transit containers, and shuffling crowds scanning the scene with desperate hollow eyes, it all reminded Deckard of similar streets he'd moved through back in L.A., only minus the flickering neon and slightly more breathable air that the annual monsoon rains managed to scrub to a lower toxicity level. "Let's have a little talk, Mr. Neiman," when Urbanton had used Deckard's alias. The smile on the video director's face had widened, like that of some reptile unhinging its jaws to swallow an entire goat in one mouthful. "By ourselves, all right?" They'd left Mrs. Neiman. She didn't even pretend to call herself Rachel anymore, sleeping on the hovel's narrow bed, or perhaps gazing up at the dark memorial vistas that played out behind her eyelids. It had been a long time since Deckard had pretended that he knew what went on inside Sarah Tyrell's head. He'd pulled the hovel's air seals shut and followed Urbanton, and the scent of money that the man had exuded. Now, sitting in the skiff's cockpit with a talking briefcase beside him, Deckard slowly nodded. "That's why I did it," as if it really needed any explanation. The guy just smelled like money. "That's a powerful attractant." The voice of Roy Batty sounded amused. "More so than all those pheromones of sex and love and pride, all that corporeal stuff that yanks people around so well. Excuse me for waxing philosophical. I have a slightly more disinterested viewpoint these days, as you might be able to tell." The voice's tone sharpened. "Just how much did Urbanton offer you?" "A lot." Deckard recited the raw numbers. "That was just for starters. What was in the production budget? Residual payments would probably have come to more once the video went out over the wires." "Not bad." "It wasn't, or wouldn't have been," Deckard corrected himself, "if I would have gotten it. Free money. or as close to that ideal state as this universe allowed. There had been virtually nothing he had to do in order to get the payment from the mysterious financial backers to whom Urbenton had constantly referred. Basically, Deckard knew, just as Urbenton had made it clear, that Speed Death Productions had only wanted to be able to list him as the technical advisor on the video. Something to keep the money people happy. A touch of authenticity for the whole project. The video was supposed to be a dramatized recreation of Deckard's life, or at least that little bit of it, when he'd been going through his last assignment as a Blade Runner. The job that Inspector Bryant had leaned on him to undertake after he'd already quit the department in disgust. According to Urbenton, that hunt, with half a dozen or so Nexus 6 models on the loose in the wilds of Los Angeles, included the group's highly dangerous leader, the replicant version of Roy Batty, and only Rick Deckard out there to round them up and ice them, had already achieved some sort of legendary, even mythic status. Enough detail had leaked out to transform it from urban folktale to big deal saga. Or so Urbenton said. Deckard hadn't cared as long as there was a payday at the end of the process. If Speed Death Productions figured that there was an audience for watching some poor bastards of escaped replicants getting blown away, that was probably a correct assessment. It tied in with Deckard's own feelings about the innate charm of the human species. All I had to do, said Deckard, was sit on my can at the edge of the set and keep my mouth shut. Urbenton wasn't exactly hiring me for my creative input, then get paid off and go home. Well, you're going home at least. Or at least back to whatever's as close as somebody like you gets. A pitying smile inflected the briefcase's voice. Too bad you couldn't pull off the part about keeping your mouth shut. You spend your whole life being the silent type, killing without a word, and then the one time it counts, you can't resist spouting off. Tell me about it. Whatever adrenaline had been left in his system, the rush from seeing death at close quarters and then letting his own anger come out like an uncorked flamethrower, was dissipated now, leaving the flat dregs of self-loathing. Silence might not be a virtue, but at least it would have been profitable. You know, I was a little surprised. Batty's voice turned thoughtful. When I was told you were up at the outer Hollywood station, and that was where Holden and I were going to track you down, make our little delivery. Me, that is. I don't recall ordering any luggage with some dead guy's personality wired into it. Well, you didn't. Whatever was inside the briefcase sounded stung by Deckard's words. It's supposed to be a surprise, smartass. If you'd known it was coming, you probably would have screwed it up somehow. As it was, poor old Holden got himself iced trying to make contact with you. That'll teach you. Deckard settled farther back into the pilot's seat, folding his arms across his chest. Send yourself airmail next time. Real funny, Deckard. You may have given up being a Blade Runner, but you're still a cold bastard. If the briefcase had had a human form, it would have nodded. That's what I like about you. Whatever. Anyway, why shouldn't I have been at Outer Hollywood? If that's where the money is. You were supposed to be long gone by now, replied Batty's voice. Wasn't that the plan? Holden told me all about it. What you decided when you were still back on Earth. You were going to get yourself and Sarah Tyrell some new identities, then hightail it out to the UN's far colonies, Out in the stars, Deckard, not in some dumpy Martian transit squat. Then you and Sarah, or were you still calling her Rachel? Then the two of you would be nice and safe, a cozy domestic couple. Believe me, Deckard could hear the sour wariness in his own voice. That last bit was never part of the plan. Wouldn't have believed it if it had been. Nevertheless, the stars. That's where you were supposed to be going. Or already have gone. So what happened? Deckard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to conserve his waning strength. What happened? He didn't feel like telling his life story to the briefcase. What happened is why I needed the money in the first place. Why I took this joke gig as technical advisor on Urbanton's crappy little video production. The UN transit colonies on Mars are a total bottleneck. People on Earth, even the living ones, don't know that. The UN keeps a tight lid on information about what's going on there. The immigration program they're so hot on would collapse if it got out that when you leave Earth, you don't go to the stars. You just wind up in some cramped, dingy hovel on Mars, glued to the cable feed or going slowly crazy from stimulus deprivation. The briefcase took pains to sound unimpressed. There's been rumors. None that I'd ever heard. Not that it would have changed my mind. There was no way I was going to stay on Earth. Why? Genuine puzzlement sounded in Batty's voice. You can die there as well as anywhere else. Believe me, I know. Deckard slowly shook his head. I had other plans. Ones I didn't tell Holden. He didn't need to know. Plans? Like what? Deckard let his eyelids draw down to stilts. Deckard let his eyelids draw down to slits. You don't need to know either. Fatigue crept up his knotted spine and down into his limbs, turning them into leaden weights. But since you asked, that's why I was hustling for the money, to buy our way off Mars. Money's always good, said the briefcase. It might not be able to do that, though. Worth a shot. Deckard didn't feel like arguing the point. There haven't been any transports leaving Mars for the far UN colonies in the last 2 or 3 years. Some kind of problem going on out there. But there's rumors. There's always rumors of travel starting up again. It'll have to. There's hardly any room left to cram people into the Martian colonies, and the UN still keeps bringing them out from Earth. Something's got to break, and if somebody's leaving, it's going to be me and Sarah Tyrell. That's what the money was going to be for. But there isn't any money, is there? You're kind of screwed on that one, Deckard. I'm screwed. It wasn't an unusual condition for him. That's the way it goes. Bad luck for you, the voice of Batty emerging from the briefcase's concealed speaker held an equally familiar smile. Good luck for me, though, and the people who sent me out to you. Now you might be a little more receptive to the offer we're going to make you. I don't want to hear it. What? What are you talking about? Batty's voice went up a notch. Don't want to hear it. Listen, Deckard, I didn't get sent all this way just for you to cop an attitude. You can be all burnt out and cynical on your own time, and this isn't it. There's things, important things, that have to be done. With his arms still folded on his chest, Deckard opened one eye wider to gaze upon the briefcase beside him. And that's why you're here? Dave Holden brought you out just so you could tell me about these important things? That's about the size of it. Deckard let the eyelid sink shut, as though of its own weight. Like I said, I don't want to hear it. Silence held in the skiff's cockpit. For a few seconds, Deckard heard only the motion of his own blood sliding through his veins, the tick of random air molecules at his eardrums. Then the cockpit's other inhabitant spoke again. "You're a cool customer, Deckard. You know that?" Whatever parts of Batty had been encoded and placed inside the briefcase, his snake-twisting mind and sharp-eyed perceptions now sounded impressed despite himself. "Nothing phases you. You've reached some kind of weird point where nothing surprises you anymore. But you're still walking around as if you're alive somehow. That's a hell of an achievement." Deckard shifted in the thinly padded seat, trying to find some comfort for his bones and muscles. "What am I supposed to be so surprised about? For Christ's sake, Deckard, I'm in a fucking box! With a handle and 2 chrome-plated locks and a decent grade of simulated leather on the exterior." Annoyance permeated the briefcase's speech. "Shit! You mean you didn't notice?" "I noticed." Deckard couldn't keep a thin smile from lifting one corner of his mouth. "Actually, I prefer you this way." "Yeah, well, it doesn't suit me at all. They should have left me at least 1 leg and a foot so I could kick your sorry ass." The disgust in Batty's voice shifted to its former perplexed condition. "Don't you wonder how this all came about? The last time you saw me, I was dead. I even got shown photographs of how I looked, hanging upside down on that busted-up freeway. Seeing your own corpse is one of those transformative experiences. Thought you didn't have eyes. There's a jack for an optical scanner inside here, along with some other stuff like that. Besides, why should you care how I saw it? That's not important, Deckard. What you should be worrying about is why all of this is being done. Why drag my corpse off? Why download my skull contents into this contraption? The whole trip. Hey, it's all for your benefit, pal, or at least most of it. If you can't display gratitude, you could at least show some courtesy." "I don't have to," Deckard said dryly. "I'm sure you're going to tell me all about it, whether I want to hear it or not." He'd been telling the truth to Batty. Deckard could let an unsoothing but necessary sleep claim him, where he pushed back in the skiff's pilot seat, with little regard, with little regret. That his old nemesis, a nightmarish figure, all glistening with rain and smeared blood over taut muscle and sinew, could come back from the dead in the form of an articulate briefcase. What was there to be surprised about? Stranger things had already happened. Once before he thought Roy Batty was safely dead, only to find out otherwise, or rather, to find out that one Batty was dead, and another, claiming to be the human original from which the replicant had been made, was trying to kill him, and coming close to accomplishing that goal, if it hadn't been for Dave Holden, who put a high-caliber slug between Batty's eyes. Deckard knew that it would have been his own corpse draped over the side of one of LA's ruined freeways. And now Holden was dead, with his former partner from the LAPD's Blade Runner unit fairly sure that he at least wouldn't be coming around again. The corpse on the floor back at the outer Hollywood studio had appeared more than final. Holden's blanked-out eyes had looked as if they had gazed at last upon and into some soul-quieting vista of peace. Maybe, thought Deckard, that's what he saw when he looked down the barrel of the Kowalski replicant's gun. Fire and thunder, and then the silence beyond. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. Batty's voice seemed to come from miles away, a distance bound by the cockpit's tiny space. You don't have to worry about that. That was a mystery almost worth puzzling out. Deckard let the black behind his eyelids deepen and swallow him up. The briefcase with Batty's personality wired in and Deckard's initials below the handle. That's what the now dead Holden had been carrying, had come all that way from Earth to deliver to him. There'd been a time when Batty and Holden had been working together, trying to kill Deckard, claiming that he was another escaped replicant. That was how wrapped up in craziness the two of them had gotten. Then they'd had their big falling out, from which only one of them had survived, or so it seemed at the time. Something had hooked the two of them back together, Holden and Batty, or whatever was left of him inside the briefcase. Something that probably wasn't good news. It was too much for Deckard to try to figure out now. At this point of his exhaustion, as long as the briefcase was quietly sulking to itself, he might as well try to find sleep. Deckard found himself half wondering, half dreaming of what reception was in store for him on Mars, how Sarah would welcome him home from his long, futile venturing.